Welcome back to another edition of the Saturday to Sunday Football Podcast. I am Paul Perdichizzi, and thank you for joining me as always. Another week of the college football season is in the book. Week 6 of the NFL season will conclude tonight with the Jets and the Bills. And here at Saturday to Sunday, we are going to break it all down. Arguably the busiest college football week of the season just concluded this weekend. It was one of the weeks you needed to have the quad box going from ESPN. You needed multiple TVs. You needed multiple screens because there was big time games going on throughout the weekend on Saturday. The 3:30 time slot was jam-packed. The evening time slot was jam-packed. And to make sure you had eyes on all of it, you needed multiple screens. You needed the DVR going. And there was a lot to break down from this weekend. So let's jump right into it. Let's kick it off with the 2025 NFL Draft Report. We're going to skip over to Devy Slant Report today because there's so much I want to talk about in the NFL Draft Report. Then we'll kind of shift gears towards the NFL landscape with the NFL Rookie Report and the Fantasy Dynasty Report. Also, just don't think there was a lot from the underclassmen, non-draft eligible prospects to really talk about this weekend that we haven't been talking about throughout the college football season. And as the title of the show talks about, I don't know if I've ever, in all the years Saturday, Sunday has been around, have ever started with the tight end position. And there's not a lot to talk about, but the performance by Tyler Warren out of Penn State this week, obviously Penn State, that big comeback over USC to stay undefeated, really impressive performance. We'll talk about Drew Allar in a couple moments, but the performance by Tyler Warren, 17 catches, 224 yards, and a touchdown. I think people might have a hard time understanding that is a season for a tight end in college football. Sometimes it's even a season for a good tight end in college football that might just not be heavily involved in a pass offense. But we see how intermittently tight ends are viable pieces at the NFL level, right? Anybody who plays fantasy knows just how much of a wasteland the tight end position has been this year. And in the college game, at times it's equally, as up and down. But Tyler Warren came into the year, was in my top 5, was in a lot of people's top 5, top 6. But we talked about over the last couple of weeks that he was arguably, he was without a doubt the most complete tight end in terms of if you want a guy with the size and frame to hold up in line, to hold up at the point of attack, to be a good run blocker, but then also be athletic enough and be able to attack the seam and be a good player in terms of the passing game. Tyler Warren brought all of that to the table. And then this week, like that performance now kind of elevates him to, it's kind of was set in stone before the season started that Colston Loveland was tight end 1 in this class. And now I think the question is does that designation belong to Colston Loveland anymore, or should it be Tyler Warren? Because you look at Colston Loveland, he doesn't have the same type of size and frame to his name where he's going to be a guy that can be that versatile, completely dual tight end where he can hold up. He's a serviceable blocker, but Loveland is going to be more of that pass catching guy. Warren, on the other hand, opens up the entire playbook in terms of, is he there blocking? Is it play action? Is he going to attack the seam? Who is he going to be mismatched with? If you put a safety on him, he's going to be able to use his physicality to create late separation. If you try to put a linebacker on him, he's going to be too athletic. Is he going to be blocking first and then have a free release? So many things that create that. Now I think the question becomes is Tyler Warren right there with Colston Loveland? Is he now in the mix to be a first-round tight end prospect? Because when you start to check off the boxes of what Tyler Warren brings to the table and what he doesn't, is there that much, we saw Sam Laporta be a round 1 tight end. We saw Michael Mayer be around 1 or top of the second round, top of the second for these guys. Late round 1, top of the second, right? That draft class, we had Dalton Kincaid go. We had Luke Musgrave go, and that's the point now. It seems like the guy they took later and Tucker Kraft is going to supersede him. But we saw Laporta, we saw Michael Mayer, we saw Dalton Kincaid, we saw Luke Musgrave. They were all, I think, in the top 50. Kincaid went round 1. The other guys top of round 2. So I think we're now saying, okay, Colston Loveland, Tyler Warren, I think that's where this is headed. These guys are going to, I think, be top 40 prospects. Who goes in round 1, we'll see. It's another strong class with wide receivers, and there's a lot of interesting quarterbacks in the mix, and it's a good O-line draft, and there's corners, so it's a strong class. But I think the conversation where it was basically assumed Colston Loveland was one, everybody else was two, but Tyler Warren has now elevated himself into the mix, where I think it's now a 1A, 1B scenario. Some teams might look at Loveland as the clear guy. Other teams might look at Warren as the clear guy, or vice versa, depending on what they want, depending on what they already have on the depth chart. So I think there's a lot of ways now this can go. But this kind of performance, on top of the size, the frame, we already knew he had ball skills. You see that, his ability to go up at the catch point. We knew he had late separation, the body control. But you add that with the athleticism he provides for a man his size and frame, with the blocking ability he has. It's going to be hard to not see him as a top 40 pick or top 50 at the worst. And I think now the conversation is like, maybe Loveland still goes ahead of him, but I think the gap has tightened significantly, where if somebody said they want to put Tyler Warren as the clear tight end 1, I could totally support that. Right now, for me, it's still Loveland 1, Warren 2. But now we're talking a 1A, 1B situation, where when the year started, it was like 1 and 4, and then it was 1 and 3, and then it was 1 and 2. Now I think we're talking 1A, 1B. I think that's where this is headed. I know Colston Loveland, that Michigan pass offense, leaves a lot to be desired, so it's not a perfect comparison. So I don't want to go overboard on the stats that Warren's putting up compared to the stats of Loveland, because I think that's doing a disservice to Colston Loveland. But I do think the conversation now exists of just how high Warren should go. And if somebody wants to make the case that he should go above Colston Loveland, I think it's a fair determination. And I think it's going to be one that NFL teams are discussing as we get closer to that 2025 NFL draft in April of next year. While we stay on, let's conclude the other tight end. I did want to bring up Jake Brinstool, 7 catches, 104 yards, and 1 touchdown. He was my number 2 tight end in the summer. He's fallen back a little bit as Tyler Warren has leapfrogged him. Mason Taylor has leapfrogged him. But there's still a lot to like of Brinstool's game. And again, he is the prototype if you're looking for a pass-catching tight end only. Lengthy frame, good size, could add more to the overall muscle and the body frame. But he's a guy who can get open. He's a guy who could attack the seam. He could be a prolific pass catching at the next level. We've seen Clemson's passing game kind of start to get going over the last couple of weeks here and look a lot better than they did last year and the beginning of this year. And we're kind of starting to see Brinstool put some games together now, showing that he could be a significant receiving threat in college football. And I think one that will intrigue teams in that top 100 mix in terms of the 2025 NFL draft. Let's spin this back to where we usually start with the NFL draft report, and that's at the quarterback position. So this past week, I think we got to go back to Penn State. Drew Allar in that game against USC. Obviously, Penn State falls behind, and he plays, while he had 3 interceptions, and we saw some of that questionable decision-making at times early in that game. We saw a player now that in the years past, this would have been a blowout loss for Penn State. And we would have seen him be completely rattled by that. But now we see a guy who, even when down early in that game, even after some bad decisions, we saw a guy rise up and have arguably one of his best second halves, best games in his entire career when it was asked to be put on him. Because while Penn State was rolling for most of this year, he was asked to be more of a game manager. And for me personally, I wanted to see him be pushed like this. To me, this speaks volumes in terms of, if you got to put more on his plate, can he do it? And this showed 30 of 43, 391 yards in that comeback victory for Penn State. Again, I still don't have him on the level of those other prospects, the Milroe, the Cam Ward, the Quinn Ewers, the Shadu Sanders, but I think he's starting to move his way up. I think he's starting to be in the top 50 mix. And if we see more performances like this, if we see more put on his plate and him answering the bell, I think you could start talking about him as a more consistent top 50 pick. And then from there, maybe a first round pick, because we know he has the raw tools. We know he has the physical attributes. But now, if we're starting to see some of that other aspects of the game kind of come together, I think that will be what carries him and catapults him into maybe the round 1 mix for the 2025 NFL draft. So really impressive performance by him. Another guy towards the top of the draft, it will be Quinn Ewers. He returns back to Texas. reclaims his starting job there, struggles out of the gate early against Oklahoma, but settles down. Texas settles down. It was a very ho-hum game, 20 of 29, 199 yards, 1 touchdown. Oklahoma's offense couldn't put anything together. So a lot wasn't, really asked of Quinn Ewers, but nice to see him back in the mix. Obviously, we know Texas very much in the national title picture, going to be in the playoff, most likely. We're going to get a lot more opportunity to evaluate Quinn Ewers to see if he belongs in that top 10 conversation as well, because he also has the physical traits and the raw traits. We want to see a little bit more consistency and refinement from his game and how he could perform when he's kind of get pushed to the wire a little bit as well. So nice to see him back. Alabama pushed again. Jalen Milroe, 209 yards, did have 2 interceptions and a touchdown, 36 yards rushing. Alabama, I think collectively as a team, is just not nearly as top heavy and as talented as we've seen in years past. And there's going to be more instances where I think Milroe's going to have to kind of, make big plays late in the game and save them. And I think this was a little bit of a combination of the other team kind of folding, letting them hang around, making some mistakes. But Milroe still made some big plays when he had to. And I think that's a sign of what we've seen from Jalen Milroe. And just like as I talked about in previous pods, Milroe to me sits right there. It's Milroe, it's Shadu, it's Cam Ward. I think those are the 3 guys who I really think are in the mix right now to be QB1. And then you have that next tier of guys afterwards where we start bringing in Quinn Ewers and Carson Beck. And we'll see about some other guys. The other wild card in this is Garrett Nussmeier out of LSU. I've talked a lot about him this season. LSU off to a terrible start in that game. Nussmeier off to a terrible start in that game. Poor decision-making early on. Couple interceptions that were bad. 22 of 51. You don't want to see that in a box score, but what you do want to see is 337 yards, 3 touchdowns, leading them back for the win over Ole Miss. I saw on Twitter today, somebody had asked Dane Brugler about Garrett Nussmeier, and he said he reminds him a lot of like a Tony Romo style player. And you know what? I hadn't thought of that comp. I think it's a great comp by Dane Brugler, who's been on the show multiple times. It's a guy I respect arguably as much as anybody in terms of the draft Twitter community, in terms of a guy who doesn't work for the NFL in any capacity. But Nussmeier shows you those highs, show you those lows. There's some inconsistency there, but there's still a lot of inexperience. There's a lot of raw traits and a lot of raw tools there. And for me, he just seems like the bigger the moment, the bigger he rises to the occasion. There's a lot to like about Garrett Nussmeier. He's another guy that I think could push his way into the mix. When you sit there and watch it, Nussmeier intrigues me as much as guys like Quinn Ewers and Carson Beck. So I don't think it's a crazy scenario to think Garrett Nussmeier pushes his way up into the mix and he's being talked about the same way people are looking at Carson Beck, same way people are talking about Quinn Ewers. I think Nussmeier has that capability to intrigue teams, and teams are going to be fascinated with what he can bring to the table. Shadu Sanders, I'm sure a lot of people on the East Coast weren't staying up late to watch that game. He almost pulled off a great comeback again for Colorado against Kansas State. He lost Travis Hunter early in that game, but Sanders, 34-40, 3 touchdowns, takes the lead, and then Colorado's defense lets it up. But really impressive performance for Sanders, again showing the capability of when the moment needs him, he can rise up, not having, his running mate there, Travis Hunter, still maybe to make the plays and show how special of a talent he is as well. Carson Beck this week, 459 yards, 3 touchdowns. Dylan Gabriel in that classic Oregon-Ohio State game, 341 yards and 2 touchdowns. Listen, I don't think there's a lot of transferable traits to the NFL to be a starter at the next level, but I think Dylan Gabriel is going to be a 5th, 6th, 7th round pick, and he's probably going to eventually catch on as a third stringer to start, maybe work his way to a backup, because you could see like the mental processing, going through progressions, keeping the offense, on track, running the scheme that is asked of him. Gabriel has that in his repertoire. Just don't think he has I think there's too many physical limitations for him to be successful at the next level as a starter, but there's a lot to like about his game. I mentioned Clemson before and their passing offense coming around. We got to give Cade Klubnik some some props. This was a guy that for a long time was very high in the Devy circuit in terms of, future guys who would be high-end quarterback prospects in terms of the NFL draft. This past week, 309 yards and 3 touchdowns. Haven't talked about him the last couple of weeks, but 235 and 2, 255 and 4, 209 and 3. Clemson has now moved their way back into contention, and they're showing as well as they've had in a while. And a lot of that is the quarterback play they've been getting out of Cade Klubnik. So I thought that was worthy of discussion, kind of putting himself back on the radar at the quarterback position. Let's take this to the running back position. A couple things stood out this past week. I already mentioned that Colorado game. DJ Giddens continues to be a player that I'm higher on than most. I think he's on that round 3, round 4. Maybe he falls a little bit in the deep running back draft, so maybe he ends up in the 4th, 5th round mix. But listen, we see guys. We saw Bucky Irvin go in the 4th round. We saw Tyrone Tracy fall to late in the 5th. NFL teams can get really quality players in those rounds. I think DJ Giddens is going to be one of those guys that, if I'm privileged to go back on like the Harris Football Pod or another pod, and they ask me like, who's that guy that like the mainstream is not talking about as much or isn't going to be in the top 5, but you really like his game, it's going to be DJ Giddens for me. I've been saying it since the summer how much I like his game. Every time I watch him, I come away more and more impressed. Dylan Sampson out of Tennessee, 112 yards and 3 touchdowns. He just continues week in and week out to perform for Tennessee. Tennessee's offense has kind of been a little bit lackluster the last couple of weeks. They've had to kind of come back and survive games, but Dylan Sampson has been producing week in and week out. Caleb Johnson at Iowa, I mentioned him a couple of weeks ago, as a guy who's on my radar to be one of the first running backs I add to the scouting notebook. 21 carries, 166 yards, and 2 touchdowns for Iowa. Continues to be one of the best runners in college football this year in terms of a production standpoint. He's going to be a guy that, went from not being on people's radars before the season started to very much in the conversation, when it comes to the 2025 NFL draft. I don't think he's a top 100 guy, but I think when you start getting into that day 3, if teams are looking for a certain style of runner, Johnson could be very intriguing to them in that 4, 5, or 6th round range for sure. Omarion Hampton, 18 carries, 137 yards, continues for me to be the clear RB2 in this draft class after Ashton Genty. Other people might have Judkins. I totally get it. For me, it's Hampton, but he's in that tier with Judkins and some other guys, but clearly a tier below Ashton Genty, who I think put himself to be in the mix to be a top 15 pick in the 2025 NFL draft. Then the wide receivers, let's start with Trey Harris. He left that game injured. I haven't seen anything just yet. 7 catches, 102 yards, and a touchdown. We've been talking about him a lot. I think the injury factor is something we got to keep a really close eye on. I mentioned before, Travis Hunter left the game injured. We'll see what comes of that, but definitely something worth to acknowledge. In that exciting Oregon-Ohio State game, Tej Johnson did his thing, but this is Evan Stewart reemerging in a big way. 7 catches, 149 yards, and a touchdown. Looked really good in that game as well. Evan Stewart kind of put himself back on the map as a guy who, taken seriously in the day 2 mix. Dorian Singer, a guy who's bounced around college football a lot, but 4 catches, 75 yards this week for Utah. Last week, 9 catches, 155 yards. The week before that, 7 catches, 95 yards. He's kind of now stacking good performances on top of each other. What we kind of thought we were going to see when he started hitting the transfer circuit and, started in Arizona and then ended up USC and, and twists and turns to now kind of lead him to Utah. But interesting player. I think we'll definitely see him in one of the all-star circuits, whether it's the Shrine Bowl or the Senior Bowl. He's a guy who could be an interesting round 5, round 6, round 7 type guy, but definitely a lot to like about Singer's game. Emeka Egbuka in that Ohio State, Oregon thriller, 10 catches, 93 yards, and a touchdown. He's stacking performance after performance, I think re-solidifying himself as a top 5 wide receiver in this class, as a round 1 pick. Egbuka, a guy who was right there as a prolific receiver when he was playing alongside other great wide receivers at Ohio State in the years past. And I think because of how exciting the freshman sensation Jeremiah Smith is, he just isn't getting the notoriety week in and week out. And I think he's a guy who's now back in the mix as a top 20, top 25 pick for sure. And then I want to talk about Luther Burden, because I feel like there was some narrative on Twitter that like people are concerned that like he's a prolific guy with the ball in his hands, but that it's almost a negative instead of a positive. I don't know where that narrative is. The NFL is becoming more and more of a space game. Luther Burden is not just a gadget player. He can do a lot. Like, you look with DJ Moore. DJ Moore is unbelievable with the ball in his hands. He shows that play strength, that toughness, that physicality. But DJ Moore could also run routes. Luther Burden could run routes. He could create separation. He's a smaller size-wise, but he's got a good stature, a good frame to him, similar in stature and frame to a guy like DJ Moore or a guy like Malik Neighbors. He can do a lot of different things on top of being prolific with the ball in his hands. So I don't buy that narrative that like that's a negative, that's the way he's being utilized in college, because they just want to find ways to get the ball in his hands. It's not like Missouri's playing with a top 10 quarterback prospect. So they're finding creative ways to get their best playmaker the ball in space. I don't think that is a knock Luther Burden. I think it shows his versatility as a player. I think he could definitely win routes and get open, but I think his best trait right now, is how prolific and exciting of a playmaker he is when he does have the ball in the open space. But I don't think that's only his game, and that's his and looked at as a guy who can't win routes. I think he's a very good route runner on top of being an electric playmaker when the ball is in his hands. So any narrative that's out there, I think it's false. I think he's right there in the mix with Tet McMillan, and Travis Hunter as the top 3 wide receivers in this class. If I had to guess right now, I think Travis Hunter goes 1. I think Tet McMillan goes 2. I think Luther Burden goes 3. But they're all so different. So it really kind of depends on what you're looking for at that wide receiver position. All right, let's spin this from the Saturday component to the Sunday component. Like I said, there was a lot to talk about there. Not a lot stood out in terms of the underclassmen. So we're skipping the Devy Slant report for this week. We'll bring it back next week if there's anything worthy to discuss from the underclassmen aspect of it who are not draft eligible. But I did want to get to the NFL rookie report because every week these rookies continue to thrive in a variety of ways. This week, we got to start with Caleb Williams, right? All the narrative that was out there, Caleb Williams, after like 2 weeks of the season, he can't play. Chicago got it wrong. Now, listen, maybe Jane Daniels is going to be better because Jane Daniels is unbelievable. And what he's done with that Washington team has been remarkable. But anybody making declarative decisions off of Caleb Williams, and I came on the air and I talked about his struggles and, aspect of his game. But I also said, I think we're going to start to see him put it together because he's just too talented of a player. And we saw him this week, 226 yards, 4 touchdowns, complete command of that Bears offense in that big win over Jacksonville Sunday morning, overseas. But he's putting it together now. I don't think Chicago is going to regret having Caleb Williams. Like I said, is it possible that they're both elite? Yeah. Is it possible Jaden Daniels is the best quarterback in the league and Caleb Williams is top 10? Sure, that's still possible. But is it possible that it flips the other way, that Caleb Williams is the best? And yeah, that's possible too. It's too early to tell. So as great as Jaden Daniels looked immediately, Caleb Williams took a couple weeks to kind of start to see that, and he's going to still have his ups and downs. He doesn't have the running component that at times could kind of make a guy look a little bit better, even if he has a suspect week in terms of the passing the football. But Caleb Williams was the story of this week from the quarterbacks, but also the story was the debut of Drake May. And listen, New England still lost big, but let's not act like he didn't add life to that offense. Significant life. 243 yards, 3 touchdowns, 20 of 33, 38 yards rushing. Better days are ahead for New England, and it's 100% because of Drake May. He's going to have some weeks that he looks dreadful, especially with the supporting cast and the environment around him right now. But Drake May is a baller. I said it again. To me, this draft class was a clear top 3, and then JJ McCarthy was kind of with Michael Penix and Bo Nix, and we'll see about them when they get their opportunity. I don't think Bo Nix is in the conversation with the top 3 guys, but I did think Drake May was right in the mix with Caleb Williams, with Jaden Daniels, and I think you're going to see all 3 of those guys, I hope, be successful at the next level. But we already saw, even with how bad that surrounding and supporting cast, we saw just how good Drake May could be this week, and I thought it speaks about his makeup, his mental makeup, his ability to make things happen. So I thought it was a really impressive performance from Drake May, even in a big loss by New England, but he made them much more competitive than they had been prior with Jacoby Brissett. He made them more exciting. He definitely injected some life into that offense. So it's going to kind of be fun to kind of watch him this year the rest of the way, provided he stays healthy. We also got the debut performance of Spencer Rattler filling in for Derek Carr in New Orleans. 22 of 40, 243 yards, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions. Obviously, they lost big to Tampa Bay, but I thought Rattler held his own very well for a day 3 rookie rust into the mix. So it'll be interesting to kind of see. I think they're going to let Rattler kind of have the football for a couple of weeks until Carr gets back from injury, and how he performs could impact whether or not he gets a real opportunity next year or down the line to be a starter. But it was nice to see him kind of put in the mix. There was no reason they should have went to Jay Kaner. Rattler, a much superior prospect in terms of the arm talent and overall ceiling and upside as a prospect. So I was glad that they gave Rattler the football this past weekend. At the running back position, we talked about him last week. We got to bring him up again. Bucky Irving and Tyrone Tracy are becoming real factors in their backfields. Now, Tampa Bay might have a third guy, Sean Tucker, formerly, rookie in the past, who fell due to some injury concerns out of Syracuse. He was a Debbie Darling for so long. He looked really good this week, but so did Bucky Irving. Rachaad White didn't play. Irving had over 100 total yards, a touchdown. He could impact the game as a receiver and as a runner. A lot to like about Bucky Irving's game. So stock definitely up on him, even with a little bit of a crowded backfield. And we'll see how that shakes itself out. Tyrone Tracy has now made it that I wonder if it's going to be a 50-50 split when Singletary comes back, or it could even possibly favor Tyrone Tracy. 17 catches, 50 yards. Cincinnati was stacking the box, daring Daniel Jones to beat them last night. They couldn't, but Tyrone Tracy was just kind of, gutting his way for tough yards. And then you also saw the receiving component. Former wide receiver. He was lining up, doing some wide receiver things, using him out of the backfield, screen passes, 6 catches, 57 yards. So Tracy went over 100 total yards and impacting the game in a variety of ways. So I think stock up very much on Tyrone Tracy. I would almost say you could say more stock up on Tracy than Bucky Irving, only because Rachaad White is still young. Great pass catcher in his own right. And then the Tucker performance kind of maybe threw him into the mix now, where in New York, Singletary's going to be there, solid veteran. Giants know they can trust him. But if Tracy can perform like he has the last couple of weeks, I think he could make Singletary the clear backup there because of his versatility. I'm not sure Bucky can do that in Tampa Bay with everybody healthy, but we'll see. But two guys that I'd be very much wanting to buy in Dynasty. I was not in on Bucky Irving before the season. I'm definitely higher on him now. I was very high on Tyrone Tracy. I went on this pod. I went on the Harris Football Pod. He was in my top 5. I comped him to guys like stylistically and collegiately. David Johnson, Alvin Kamara at Tennessee, talked about the contact balance, talked about the versatility, the size, the frame, the quickness, the burst. There's a lot to like about Tyrone Tracy's game. I think he could be a real factor. Giants might have found their future starting running back for a period of time in the late 5th round. And that kind of is fun to watch here as a Giants fan, that they might have got their starting tight end, Theo Johnson, for a couple of years. Obviously, Malik Neighbors is a star, and maybe potentially, a big-time weapon in Tyrone Tracy at the backfield as well, all in one draft class. Let's kind of finish off tonight with the Fantasy Dynasty Report for this week and kind of talk about the big hitters from this past week. At the quarterback position, listen, there's been a lot of uncertainty at the quarterback position. We've seen guys underperform. The questions, I think, continue to be there about Trevor Lawrence. Kyler Murray is an enigma, and there's times that he looks like he's a bona fide superstar, and then times where he just looks like if he doesn't get it going on the ground game, his passing is just too up and down, too inconsistent. Jalen Hurts, there's question marks about, like, has the league kind of caught up to him? He's playing there with 2 elite wide receivers. Is it Nick Sirianni holding him back? Like, I don't know what to make of Jalen Hurts' struggles, often being salvaged by either a big play by his receiver or, the tush push for short yardage rushing touchdowns. But the guy who I'd still want to be buying stock in right now at the quarterback position is Jordan Love. I think he is on the trajectory. I think he's going to win a Super Bowl at some point for Green Bay. I think he adds a little bit in terms of the ground game, a guy who maybe will rush for like 200 to 250 yards, maybe sneak in a couple touchdowns. But you're talking about a guy who could spread the field. He can make every NFL throw. I love Jordan Love right now. He'd be a guy very much like basically, the way we view Joe Burrow, I think you should be viewing Jordan Love the same way. And I know they don't add a lot on the ground, but he adds some to the ground. And I do wonder if we artificially put guys like Anthony Richardson and Kyler Murray ahead of these guys because of that X factor in the running game. But Jordan Love and Joe Burrow are such better passers than both of them that should we have Richardson and Kyler Murray and guys like that clearly behind Joe Burrow and Jordan Love, I think I'm starting to trend in that way. And I really do think Jordan Love should be rising on people's boards. He'd be a guy that I think is still people look at as like 10-ish, 9, 10 in dynasty quarterback ranks. I think I would have him higher than that. And I'd be aggressive in trying to get him now because I think he's going to be a guy that is a guy you still can buy, and it's not at his highest price just yet. I'm not sure. You look at a guy like CJ Stroud and where he's valued in Dynasty, I'm not sure Jordan Love shouldn't be right there side by side with him. Jordan Love's actually going to run more than CJ Stroud, so he'll add a little bit there, and I think he can be equally as good of a passer as CJ Stroud, and I think that there shouldn't be that gap that maybe exists between a guy like CJ Stroud and Jordan Love. At the running back position, stock down on Travis Etienne. We talked about him, last week when I mentioned stock up on Tank Bigsby. Now he got hurt, but even that, he just doesn't look like the same explosive player. And with Bigsby playing so well, it's hard not to say, if one's going up, one's got to go down. Now, maybe there's been some rumblings that maybe they would consider trading him. That might change the narrative a little bit if he got into a new situation. But right now, with Bigsby emerging only in his second year, Etienne needed that heavy workload. He hasn't been hitting the big plays, which is what he should as a big play back, as a space back, but he just hasn't been doing it just yet. So I think stock down a little bit on Etienne. Not sure he should be in that top 10, top 12 dynasty running back landscape right now. I know we have older guys in the mix, but I mean, Derrick Henry's not slowing down. Like over the next 2 years, would you rather have Derrick Henry or Travis Etienne? I think it's a no-brainer right now with Derrick Henry. And then who knows 2 years down the line? You can make the case for how good Joe Mixon's been. If he's going to be there the rest of this year and one more year in Houston as the clear bell cow, are we sure we want Travis Etienne ahead of him for the, I know we think bigger picture in Dynasty, but when you're talking running backs, I really think we got to narrow it down. And sometimes I find myself gravitating. I know I did a couple startups this year, and I'm having a lot of, regret that I drafted Jonathan Brooks over Derrick Henry. I drafted Trey Benson over Alvin Kamara. And the truth be told is I'd be in first place right now and probably the best team in the league if in those back-to-back rounds I had drafted Derrick Henry and Alvin Kamara and just worried about the next 2 years and didn't have an eye on beyond that by taking Brooks and Benson ahead of those two guys, where I believe in the youth guys, and I started that draft with all wide receivers at the top. But then when I got to like round 4, round 5, round 6, I wish I would have pulled the trigger on Derrick Henry and Alvin Kamara instead of Jonathan Brooks and Trey Benson, because I think we just got to start narrowing our running back window to really 2 years. 2 years, and then who knows how the running back landscape will look with how many people come into the league and how quickly things change. Stock up on Tony Pollard. I think he's running as good as we've seen him in a while. Last year, stock really plummeted with him, but he's looking like the guy from 2 years ago. That guy going into last season was in most round 1 redraft. So stock up on Tony Pollard. I think this year, I thought might have been his last somewhat relevant fantasy year. I think we're now could have a real possibility of this year and all of next year him being a really reliable, dependable asset there. And then David Montgomery. Detroit offers him an extension. I thought this might have been this and maybe one more year, but now you kind of feel confident that Montgomery is going to play at least this year and maybe 2 more years in Detroit in that prolific offense, sharing the workload with Jahmyr Gibbs. But I think this hurts Jahmyr Gibbs a little bit, but I think it really solidifies David Montgomery as a rock-solid RB2 for the next maybe 2 years. And that we don't usually have that kind of, in terms of where we thought about Montgomery before, I feel a lot better about Montgomery now in Dynasty than I did just, 7 days ago for sure. And at the wide receiver position, we'll stick with David Montgomery's teammate. I think stock up on Jameson Williams, and I still think you can buy him at a reasonable cost right now because he's not getting heavy volume. Amon-Ra's there. Jahmyr Gibbs is there. I know Sam Laporte is having a down year, but he's there. I still think you can buy Jameson Williams now at a semi-reasonable cost, and I think we have not seen the best out of him yet. yet. He's still kind of developing and refining after his weird start to his career with injury, suspension, stuff like that. So I want to buy right now on Jameson Williams because I think he's going to be an explosive playmaker. I love him coming out of college, and I still think there's an opportunity to buy him right now at a reasonable cost. So there it is, guys, the Fantasy Dynasty Report, the NFL Rookie Report, and the NFL Draft Report for this week of the college football season. If you're enjoying this content, please get over to the website, S2S Football, fastest and easiest way to check out anything that we offer. For $9.99, you get access to all our premium notebooks. The scouting notebook immediately available. It's like 90 prospects already in there. More will be added. So many adjustments to that. And then you get the rankings notebook, all our different rankings, our draft eligible rankings, our dynasty rookie rankings, our Devy rankings, our positional dynasty rankings. And then in April, you get the NFL draft projections notebook, tabs for every position, offense and defense, over 400 players in there, snapshot of how they win, developmental areas, their combine measurements, their combine testing numbers, and the tabs are put in basically everything we are hearing, listening, and reading on terms of how we project to go off the weekend of the NFL draft. There's tabs for projecting the top 32 picks in the draft, the top 100, and every pick in the draft. We've had tremendous success. It is a great resource for the month of April and then for draft weekend in particular. So on behalf of our sound tech engineer, David Nakano, and myself, thank you for joining us, and we look forward next time taking you from Saturday to Sunday.